There is a familiar way to talk about artificial intelligence. It starts with dread. It moves quickly to collapse. Jobs disappear. Truth dissolves. Machines outthink us. Society becomes passive, manipulated, optimized, and somehow less human. Superagency begins by interrupting that reflex. Reid Hoffman, writing with Beato, does not deny that AI carries risk. He argues something more unsettling for our habits of thought. Maybe the bigger mistake is that we have trained ourselves to ask only what could go wrong and almost never what could go right. And that is why this book matters. It is not a naive celebration of tech for tech's sake. It is an attempt to relocate the entire conversation about AI around one central question. Does this technology expand human agency or shrink it? Before we go deeper, if you come to this channel to keep sharpening your mind and to keep getting thoughtful summaries from major authors, take a second to like, share, and comment on this video. That simple gesture helps this work continue, and it helps more people find ideas that are actually worth sitting with. Because this book is not merely about software, it is about the future shape of human possibility. And to set the tone for this summary, I want to invite you into a small ritual that fits the spirit of the book. If you're open to the idea that AI should be built to strengthen people rather than diminish them, type this in the comments. I choose agency. It is short, easy, and it captures the deepest thread running through everything Hoffman and Beato are trying to say. Reid Hoffman is not writing from the outside looking in. Public materials about the book and the authors describe him as the LinkedIn co-founder, a longtime investor, a former OpenAI board member, and a technologist who has spent years thinking about networks, scale, and how tools reshape institutions. Beato brings a different but highly complementary lens as a writer on technology and culture whose work has appeared across major publications for decades. That pairing matters. Superagency is not written only as a policy brief, and not only as an engineer's argument. It is written as a cultural intervention. The book wants to influence how ordinary readers, professionals, founders, regulators, and citizens imagine the next phase of AI. Publicly available contents show a very clear architecture. After an introduction called "Humanity Has Entered the Chat," the book moves through chapters titled "Big Knowledge: What Could Possibly Go Right," and brings the triumph of the private commons. Testing, 1, 2, infinity, innovation is safety, informational GPS, law is code, networked autonomy, the United States of AI, America, and you can get there from here. That structure tells you something immediately. This is not a book about model architecture, benchmark races, or a catalog of product demos. It is a book about what AI means when it leaves the lab and enters everyday life, politics, law, knowledge, and collective decision-making. The introduction, "Humanity Has Entered the Chat," establishes the historical moment. The phrase itself suggests a threshold has been crossed. AI is no longer only a back-end system classifying images, optimizing ads, or running quietly inside enterprise tools. With the arrival of systems like ChatGPT and other widely accessible assistants, ordinary people are now directly in conversation with machine intelligence. Hoffman has said in interviews that this shift matters because these tools work with us and for us rather than merely on us. That distinction is crucial. A surveillance camera using AI to identify faces exercises power over you. A chatbot helping you think, write, compare options, or learn a topic can feel more like an instrument of your own intention. The book starts from that transition. AI has become interactive, participatory, and personal. That opening move also explains the central concept of agency. In the world of this book, agency means more than freedom in the abstract. It means the capacity to make choices, pursue goals, and bring meaningful outcomes into reality. If intelligence helps us weigh possibilities and energy helps us act, then AI appears here as a new amplifier of both. Hoffman's argument, repeated across interviews and summaries, is that AI can make intelligence more abundant In the same way, earlier technologies made energy, mobility, or communication more abundant. The authors are asking readers to stop seeing AI primarily as an alien force and to begin seeing it as a tool that can increase the range and quality of human action. But the title is not agency. It is superagency. That extra word signals the move from individual benefit to networked social benefit. Hoffman repeatedly uses the automobile as an analogy. A car expands my own movement, yes. But when millions of people have cars, the world changes in ways no single driver could generate alone. A doctor can reach a homebound patient. Supply chains widen. Social life reorganizes. Geography itself becomes newly negotiable. In the same way, the argument of superagency is that AI becomes most powerful, not when one elite group gains access to superpowers, but when a critical mass of people do. A student with an AI tutor benefits. A society where millions of students have AI tutors changes the educational baseline. A lawyer with better tools benefits. A legal system where ordinary citizens can better understand rules and procedures becomes more navigable. Superagency is therefore not just enhanced personal capability. It is compound social capability. That compound effect shapes the tone of the first stretch of the book. Hoffman and Beato are trying to free the reader from a scarcity mindset about intelligence itself. When intelligence becomes cheaper, faster, and more widely distributed, the social consequences can be profound. The early chapters ask us to think about AI less like a luxury gadget and more like infrastructure. That is why the book keeps returning to broad, civilization-scale comparisons rather than narrow product examples. Printing presses, electricity, automobiles, GPS, smartphones, these are not mentioned because the authors want to sound grand. They are mentioned because the book's core claim is that AI may belong in that category of general-purpose tools that reorganize societies over time. That takes us naturally into Big Knowledge, one of the book's most revealing chapters. The title suggests a shift beyond big data, and that is exactly the territory the authors seem to explore. If the previous digital era was about collecting vast amounts of information, the AI era promises something different: the ability to transform raw information into usable understanding at speed and scale. That does not mean AI becomes omniscient, and the book does not depend on pretending it is infallible. It means that machine systems can increasingly synthesize, summarize, translate, compare, infer, and retrieve patterns across enormous bodies of material in ways that make knowledge more accessible to ordinary people. This is where many of Hoffman's public examples fit. He has talked about using AI to explain complex subjects at different levels, from a 5-year-old to a teenager to an adult. He has described pointing a camera at an object and asking what it is. Those examples may sound simple, almost trivial, but the book treats them as early signs of something larger. What changes when expertise becomes more available on demand? What happens when a person facing a medical question, a legal form, a technical problem, or a creative block can reach a reasonably capable assistant immediately? The answer is not that expertise disappears. The answer is that access changes, and access changes who gets to move. Big Knowledge also reframes the fear that AI will make people intellectually lazy. The authors do not deny that some skills will weaken as others strengthen. Every important technology has done that. Few people memorize long routes the way they once did because GPS exists. Fewer people calculate by hand because calculators exist. Fewer of us keep phone numbers in memory because our devices do it for us. But history suggests a more complicated pattern than simple decline. We surrender some tasks and gain new capacities. The question is not whether AI will preserve every old mental habit. The question is whether, on balance, it increases our practical ability to learn, decide, create, and collaborate. The book's optimism becomes sharper in the chapter called, "What Could Possibly Go Right?" This seems to be one of its conceptual centers, and public commentary around the book often points back to this chapter. The point here is not empty positivity. It is a discipline of imagination. Hoffman argues that public debate around technology often overweights feared downside scenarios and underweights the moral importance of upside scenarios. If AI could help researchers move faster on disease, if it could bring tutoring to children who never had access to personalized instruction, if it could reduce the frictions that keep people out of legal systems, healthcare systems, and educational systems, then refusing to develop or deploy it also carries ethical consequences. Delay is not neutral. Caution is not costless. That logic matters especially in the way the book frames human suffering that already exists. One of the strongest publicly discussed examples from the book concerns mental health. Public summaries of the chapter reference the Coco case and broader arguments about the shortage of therapists, the scale of need, and the possibility that AI-assisted support could expand access rather than replace human care. The ethical pressure point here is powerful. When millions are underserved by current institutions, it is not enough to say that an imperfect new tool might cause harm. You must also ask what harm is already being caused by scarcity, delay, exclusion, and institutional failure. The book repeatedly pushes the reader toward that fuller accounting. A related example appears in medical communication. Public summaries of the book point to research showing that AI-generated responses in clinical-style settings were sometimes rated as more complete and even more empathetic than human responses. Whether or not any one study becomes decisive, the authors use examples like this to challenge a comforting assumption that human origin automatically guarantees human quality. In many contexts, what people need is not purity of source, but usefulness, accuracy, clarity, availability, and care. If AI can raise the floor of support, especially for people who currently get little or none, the moral argument for experimentation grows stronger. This chapter also widens into a more humanistic ambition. Arianna Huffington's discussion of the book highlights the author's notion that AI could, in principle, help us become more patient, more generous, and more emotionally capable, not only more productive. That is one of the most distinctive things about Superagency. It is not content with saying AI may help us do more. It wants to ask whether AI can help us become better versions of ourselves. That is a risky claim, and many readers will resist it. But it gives the book a philosophical depth that separates it from standard techno-optimism. The goal is not maximal efficiency. The goal is enhanced humanity. And this is a good moment for the second small act of participation. If this idea lands with you, that tools should not only make us faster, but should also make us wiser in how we live, drop this in the comments. I see the upside. That phrase matters here because Hoffman and Beato are not asking for blind faith. They are asking for disciplined attention to possibilities that public discourse often ignores. From there, the book turns to The Triumph of the Private Commons, and the title is telling. The chapter appears to address one of the hardest tensions in the AI era: the relationship between shared data, personal privacy, public benefit, and institutional trust. The phrase private commons sounds paradoxical on purpose. It points toward a structure in which data and knowledge are neither treated as purely private property, nor simply surrendered into unaccountable public exposure. Instead, the book seems to advocate for forms of governed sharing that can generate broad benefit while protecting individuals from straightforward exploitation. This chapter's logic can be reconstructed from several public references. Hoffman and commentators around the book compare AI infrastructure to systems like GPS, which involved public-private coordination and produced widespread benefits without requiring every user to understand the deep machinery underneath. The book appears to argue that societies need shared informational resources if they want broad empowerment. If every dataset is locked away, every capability hoarded, and every model available only to a narrow elite, then AI will deepen concentration rather than distribute agency. The private commons becomes the attempt to imagine shared informational ecosystems that enable many people to act more effectively. This is not presented as a utopian free-for-all. Trust is central. The chapter likely recognizes that data sharing without governance easily turns into surveillance or extraction. That is why the private commons matters as a design principle rather than a slogan. The point is not more data at any cost. The point is to build structures where shared information can empower citizens, patients, students, workers, and communities instead of simply enriching the institutions that collect it. In the background here is a classic problem of the digital age. Knowledge can liberate, but data architectures can also dominate. The book wants to capture the former without surrendering to the latter. That tension leads naturally into testing 1 to infinity, a chapter that seems to carry much of the book's practical philosophy of development. Across Hoffman's interviews, one phrase appears again and again: iterative deployment. This is one of the book's defining ideas. Rather than insisting that powerful technologies must be perfected in theory before they enter the world, the authors argue that many forms of safety and usefulness emerge through real-world use, feedback, adjustment, and repeated testing. The title's infinity symbol signals that this is not a one-time validation, but an ongoing process. This position is easy to caricature as move fast and break things, but that is not the book's actual posture. The argument is subtler. If you insist on solving every problem before broad deployment, you may lock society out of the very learning process by which better solutions arise. Real users discover edge cases, collective experience surfaces, failure modes. Iteration reveals where guardrails are needed. In Hoffman's public comments, this is often connected to the rollout of systems like ChatGPT, where public interaction generated criticism, improvement, and new norms simultaneously. Testing at scale becomes not recklessness by default, but a source of knowledge. The authors are especially concerned with the alternative, the precautionary mindset that treats uncertainty as a reason for paralysis. Throughout the book's public summaries, Hoffman contrasts a permissionless innovation tradition with calls to drastically slow or halt AI development. He does not say regulation is unnecessary. He says regulation should be intelligent, specific, and responsive to measurable harms. That distinction matters. You can target cybercrime, bioterror risks, fraud, or other concrete harms without freezing the entire field under a haze of generalized anxiety. Testing, in this vision, is how societies learn what actually needs regulation and what merely feels frightening, because it is new. That argument becomes even clearer in Innovation is Safety, perhaps the most counterintuitive chapter in the book. Most people assume innovation and safety pull in opposite directions. The faster you move, the more danger you create. The chapter title challenges that assumption directly. Hoffman often illustrates this with cars. Early automobiles were dangerous, but societies did not make them safer by stopping automotive development until perfection was achieved. They made them safer by improving brakes, roads, lighting, seat belts, bumpers, traffic rules, manufacturing quality, and emergency response. Safety did not arise outside innovation. It arose through innovation. This is a major philosophical claim in Superagency. It suggests that some hazards of AI will be reduced not by freezing progress, but by pushing toward better systems, more reliable models, stronger oversight tools, better auditing, more transparent architectures, more precise user controls, more capable monitoring agents, and more informed users. If AI can generate misinformation, AI may also help detect misinformation. If AI can be used for manipulation, AI can also be built to expose manipulated material or surface disagreement and uncertainty. Hoffman has described future agents that could challenge content, point users toward conflicting evidence, and increase rather than reduce decision quality. In that sense, innovation can become a route to alignment. The beauty of this chapter is that it reframes the debate away from a crude choice between acceleration and responsibility. The book's view is that responsibility often requires acceleration of the right kind. If the world needs better medical access, better educational support, better scientific discovery, and more resilient democratic systems, then simply delaying AI in the name of caution may itself become irresponsible. Of course, the authors know this argument can be abused by industry players who invoke future benefit to excuse present carelessness. That is why the book keeps tying innovation to agency. The relevant question is not whether innovation happens. It is whether innovation is directed toward broad human empowerment and subjected to real-world correction. By this stage in the book, you can feel the underlying worldview clearly. Hoffman and Beato are techno-humanists. They do not treat technology as the enemy of humanity, but as one of the central ways humanity extends itself. Public descriptions of the book stress that they reject the familiar narrative in which every major technological advance is first discussed as a threat to our essence. On their account, tools have always been among the things that make us more fully human by widening what we can know, do, build, share, and care for. That is not a blind denial of harm. It is a refusal to let the fear of deformation erase the possibility of enlargement. The chapter Informational GPS pushes that worldview into an especially useful metaphor. GPS matters because it is a model of navigation, not command. A GPS system does not usually replace your agency. It helps you orient your agency. It reduces friction, surfaces options, and assists judgment without forcing a destination. Applied to AI, the metaphor suggests that one of the technology's best futures lies in helping people move through complexity. The world is overloaded with information, contradiction, noise, and procedural difficulty. In that environment, AI may function not as a master system, deciding for us, but as a guide making difficult terrain more legible. This is a smart metaphor because it avoids two extremes at once. On one side is the fantasy that AI will know everything and decide perfectly. On the other side is the fear that any machine guidance automatically destroys human freedom. GPS illustrates a middle possibility. It can mislead you. It can be wrong. It can also save time, lower stress, reveal paths you would not have found, and make unfamiliar spaces manageable. The book appears to imagine AI playing a similar role across knowledge work, bureaucracy, health systems, education, and civic life. Not infallible oracle, not mindless tool, something closer to cognitive navigation. Think about how many parts of modern life are not limited by lack of raw information, but by our inability to process the information we already have. Laws are published, but unreadable. Medical guidance exists, but inaccessible. Educational resources are abundant, but badly matched to individual learners. Public services are available but entangled in procedures. Superagency sees AI as potentially transformative precisely because it can lower those cognitive barriers. If a person can more easily understand a contract, compare treatment options, prepare for a difficult meeting, learn a new skill, or interpret a government requirement, that person has not merely received information. That person has gained maneuverability. At roughly the midpoint of the book, this is where the project becomes emotionally compelling. Superagency is not finally about making smart people smarter. It is about making complex societies more navigable for everyone. And if that theme resonates, here is the second micro-commitment prompt I want to place right here in the heart of the summary. Comment, I'm ready. Not because readiness solves everything, but because the book keeps insisting that participation matters. A passive public gets the future it is handed. An engaged public has a chance to shape it. The next chapter, Law is Code, turns from navigation to structure. The title clearly echoes Lawrence Lessig's influential idea that code can regulate behavior just as law does. The built environment of digital systems sets the real conditions of action. A platform can allow anonymity or demand identity. A payment system can permit certain transactions and block others. A model interface can make sources visible or hide them. A recommendation engine can expose diversity or trap users in reinforcement loops. In that sense, code is not merely a neutral container for action. It is part of the rule system under which action takes place. This chapter is essential because it grounds the book's optimism in institutional realism. It is one thing to say AI can amplify human agency. It is another to ask whose agency gets amplified, under what conditions, with what defaults, incentives, and constraints. If the architecture of AI systems is built for manipulation, extraction, lock-in, or hidden asymmetry, then the promised gains in agency may turn out to be selective and fragile. The chapter title alone signals that the authors understand this. Real freedom in the AI era will depend not only on model capability, but on platform design, interoperability, accountability, disclosure, and the alignment of technical choices with democratic values. Law as code therefore seems to serve as a warning against superficial optimism. You cannot just release capable systems and hope for the best. You must recognize that technical design is governance. Defaults matter, interfaces matter, ownership matters, competitive structure matters. If one company controls the gateway to cognition, knowledge, workflow, and public communication, the problem is not just whether its model hallucinates. The problem is whether it quietly becomes a lawmaker without democratic legitimacy. By invoking the relationship between law and code, the book situates AI inside the long struggle over who writes the rules of social life. This chapter also deepens the book's discussion of regulation. One of Hoffman's consistent public arguments is that regulation should focus on specific harmful outcomes, not broad fear of innovation itself. Law as code helps explain why. If code shapes conduct, then regulation that ignores architecture will miss the real source of power. Conversely, if law is too blunt and too detached from technical reality, it may punish surface symptoms while leaving structural problems untouched. The book seems to advocate for a more literate form of governance, one that understands how design decisions affect agency on the ground. From there, networked autonomy develops another paradox at the center of modern life. We become more free through systems that we do not control individually. Cars gave people unprecedented mobility, but only because societies built roads, licenses, signals, standards, insurance systems, and rules of right-of-way. The freedom to drive did not emerge from pure chaos. It emerged from a managed network. The same pattern likely applies to AI. Personal assistants, recommendation systems, educational tools, and automated services do not exist in isolation. They operate inside ecosystems. Networked autonomy asks what it means to preserve meaningful, individual freedom inside those shared technical environments. This is one of the book's most mature themes. Freedom here is not romanticized as total absence of constraint. Instead, the authors seem to argue that some constraints are enabling. Standardization, safety measures, interoperability, and common rules can increase practical agency by making systems more trustworthy and usable at scale. But the chapter also raises the central danger. Networks can empower or enclose. If they are designed to reduce cognitive load while keeping people in charge, they can expand autonomy. If they are designed to manipulate preferences, extract dependence, or make exit impossible, they become cages disguised as conveniences. That is why networked autonomy has a political edge. In an AI-saturated world, many decisions will increasingly be mediated by agents, rankings, alerts, filters, and system-level optimization. Some choices may become easier because the system handles complexity for you. But the question never goes away: Who chose the objectives of that system? What values shaped its optimization? How visible are its trade-offs? Can users leave? Can they compare? Can they override? Can they understand why something happened? Superagency does not present autonomy as isolation. It presents it as a condition that must be protected within networks that are growing more powerful and more invisible. By this point, the book's optimism has become harder than it first appeared. It is not the optimism of everything will work out. It is the optimism of design, iteration, pluralism, and participation. The authors believe the good future is buildable, but only if the architecture of AI remains connected to human agency at every level: individual, institutional, democratic, and geopolitical. That geopolitical dimension comes fully into view in the United States of AI, America. Public summaries and interviews suggest that this chapter broadens the frame from individual tools and domestic systems to national strategy, global competition, and the role of democratic societies in shaping the next wave of intelligence infrastructure. Hoffman has been explicit in interviews that countries which adopt the cognitive industrial revolution sooner and more effectively will gain economic strength and influence over global norms. He has also said he wants liberal democracies, rather than authoritarian powers, to lead that transition. This chapter is where the book's optimism becomes clearly strategic. AI is not treated only as a consumer tool or workplace assistant. It is treated as national capacity. Public summaries reference the idea of sovereign AI, meaning the growing importance of countries developing and governing AI capabilities in ways that reflect their own interests, institutions, and cultural values. That does not necessarily mean total autarky or nationalist isolation. It means that in a world where intelligence infrastructure shapes education, productivity, defense, research, public services, and media, nations will increasingly care about who builds the systems they depend on. The title AI, America, also hints at the book's possible dual focus in this chapter. On one level, it likely explores America's position in the AI race, including the innovation advantages created by research ecosystems, private capital, entrepreneurial culture, and relatively open experimentation. On another level, it probably interrogates the American political tradition itself. Can a democracy handle a technology moving at this speed and scale? Can public institutions update? Can regulation remain intelligent rather than theatrical? Can innovation remain broad-based rather than captured? Can citizens remain genuine stakeholders rather than passive consumers of decisions made elsewhere? This is where the book's emphasis on participation and democratic agency becomes especially important. Hoffman and Beato are not simply saying that the United States should win in a narrow techno-nationalist sense. They are saying that the values embedded in AI matter, and that political systems which preserve contestation, accountability, and citizen voice have reasons to stay active in the building process rather than retreat from it. Public commentary about the book referenced examples like Taiwan's Polis platform, which used technology to surface areas of public agreement rather than only amplify polarization. That example fits perfectly here. The question is whether AI will deepen democratic responsiveness or merely scale bureaucracy, manipulation, and surveillance. And there is no denying that the book's critics will be most alert at this stage. Public reviews note that some readers see Superagency as too friendly to industry, too skeptical of precaution, or too trusting that markets and democratic oversight can be harmonized. That criticism is worth hearing. The book is clearly more optimistic than many contemporary AI discussions, and its belief in iterative deployment and permissionless innovation will make some readers uneasy. But the stronger way to read it is not as a refusal to see danger. It is as an argument that danger must be evaluated against opportunity, and that democratic societies harm themselves when they answer every new capability first with self-limitation, while less accountable systems push ahead. If you've gotten this far, You've probably felt that the book is trying to recruit a certain kind of reader, not a worshiper of technology, not a cynic who sees only extraction, but someone willing to work through tension without collapsing into fatalism. And that feels like the right place for the 2/3 mark reminder. If this summary is helping you think more clearly, please like, share, and comment on the video. Not mechanically, but because ideas like these get stronger when thoughtful people push them into broader conversation. This channel grows because people who care about understanding, not just reacting, decide to pass the work on. The final chapter, You Can Get There From Here, gathers the book's principles into a forward-looking conclusion. Public summaries of this chapter emphasize 4 main ideas. First, design for human agency. Second, treat shared data and knowledge as potential engines of empowerment rather than default instruments of control. Third, understand that innovation and safety can be mutually reinforcing rather than inherently opposed. Fourth, recognize that AI's effects will compound socially as more people gain access and capability. That is essentially the manifesto form of the whole book. But the value of the final chapter is not just that it repeats prior points. It places them in an attitude toward the future. The world opened by AI is, in the author's telling, still only partially mapped. That uncertainty naturally produces anxiety. People want guarantees, settled doctrines, and final rules before they move. Hoffman and Beato argue that those guarantees will not arrive in advance. The only way through is exploratory, adaptive, and forward-looking. Try, measure, revise. Broaden participation. Keep democratic oversight active. Let real-world learning inform both design and governance. Refuse both paralysis and recklessness. That is the cadence of the ending. The chapter also appears to widen the moral frame once more. Several public summaries note that the authors ask readers not to treat AI as the single risk that eclipses all others, but also as a possible tool for reducing other large-scale risks already facing humanity. Disease, educational inequality, institutional inefficiency, climate problems, and perhaps even existential threats in the long run. This is an important turn. It stops AI from being viewed in isolation. A world without advanced AI is not automatically a safe world. It is still a world with pandemics, wars, energy transitions, misinformation, and massive disparities in access to expertise. The book insists that intelligent tools could become part of humanity's response capacity. That idea brings the whole architecture into focus. Humanity has entered the chat, says the threshold has already been crossed. Big Knowledge argues that usable understanding is becoming more abundant. What could possibly go right? Disciplines imagination toward beneficial outcomes. The triumph of the private commons asks how shared informational resources can empower rather than dominate. Testing 1, 2, infinity defends learning through deployment. Innovation is safety reframes progress as a source of better guardrails. Informational GPS imagines AI as navigation through complexity. Law as Code reminds us that technical architecture is governance. Networked autonomy asks how freedom survives in powerful systems, the United States of AI. America situates all of this inside democratic competition and national strategy, and You Can Get There From Here converts the whole sequence into a stance. Build, participate, measure, steer. What makes this sequence effective is that it moves from personal experience to societal systems to political structure without losing the core idea. The same question repeats at every level. Does AI increase meaningful human agency? Not symbolic agency, not the illusion of choice, not passive dependence on black boxes. Meaningful agency, the ability to understand more, act more effectively, coordinate better, access help faster, and live with greater possibility. That is why the book's optimism does not feel, at its best, like salesmanship. It feels like an attempt to defend ambition in a moment when fear has become intellectually fashionable. Hoffman's public interviews make clear that he sees this transition as turbulent. He has called it a cognitive industrial revolution and acknowledged that some jobs will disappear, that institutions will strain, and that adaptation will be uneven. He has also warned that people who refuse to use these tools may become under-equipped in professional life. None of that sounds painless. The book's optimism is therefore not that change will be easy. It is that the destination can be better if we remain active in shaping it. Still, the book leaves important questions hanging, and a fair summary should say so. First, how much trust should we place in the companies building these systems when they also profit from speed, scale, and dependency? Second, how do we ensure that the private commons does not become a euphemism for extracting more data under a language of shared good? Third, if code is law, who gets to audit the lawmakers? Fourth, can iterative deployment work fast enough to reduce harm without normalizing harmful releases as the price of progress? Fifth, even if AI expands agency, for many will it also intensify asymmetries for those who control infrastructure, compute, and distribution? Superagency does not ignore these questions, but it often answers them with confidence in competition, democratic governance, and public feedback. Some readers will find that confidence justified, others will not. But even the skeptics should recognize what the book contributes. It restores a neglected category to the AI debate: aspiration. Much of the public conversation swings between apocalyptic forecasting and narrow utility. Either AI destroys us, or it helps us write emails faster. Superagency refuses both frames as too small. It asks us to think in terms of civilizational direction without surrendering to inevitability. It invites readers to imagine AI as a broad-based amplifier of human capacity, while also insisting that institutions, design choices, and governance determine whether that amplification becomes liberating or coercive. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of the title after all. Superagency is not machine supremacy. It is not the moment when AI becomes the main character. It is the opposite. It is the possibility that abundant machine intelligence could expand the practical freedom, competence, and humanity of large numbers of people at once. The point is not to kneel before a smarter tool. The point is to make smarter tools serve a more capable society. That is also why the phrase, "what could possibly go right," matters more than it first appears. It sounds playful, even provocative. But in the logic of the book, it becomes a moral challenge. Are we capable of imagining better futures with the same seriousness that we imagine catastrophic ones? Are we able to see that the failure to build can also be a failure of responsibility? Can we distinguish between prudence and retreat, between oversight and stagnation, between real empowerment and merely efficient dependence? Those are not side questions. They are the questions. If I had to compress the book to one sentence, it would be this: AI should be judged by whether it makes human beings and human societies more capable of pursuing meaningful ends together. Everything in the book radiates from that center. The examples change, the metaphors change, the political stakes widen, but the standard remains constant. So what should a viewer actually take away from all of this? First, stop thinking of AI only as a threat or only as a gimmick. The book argues that it is better understood as a general-purpose amplifier whose long-term significance depends on how broadly and wisely it is integrated. Second, pay attention to agency as your measuring stick. Does a tool help you understand, decide, create, or coordinate better? Or does it make you more dependent, more manipulable, and less aware of how decisions are being shaped? Third, expect transition pain without turning that pain into an argument for surrender. Fourth, remember that governance is not external to technology. Design choices, market structure, standards, and law all co-produce the future. Fifth, do not underestimate the power of widespread access. The social gains become largest when many people, not a small elite, gain useful assistance. And finally, do not let the future be narrated only by those who profit from fear. Fear has its place. It can identify real risks, But a society that cannot imagine constructive futures becomes easy to immobilize. Superagency is, at heart, a book against immobilization. It is an argument that we should meet AI with ambition, scrutiny, adaptation, and democratic participation, not with either worship or despair. This is also where the book's taxonomy of attitudes becomes helpful. In interviews, Hoffman describes 4 broad camps: doomers, who fear catastrophic AI and often want development stopped; gloomers, who accept AI is coming but expect mostly degrading outcomes; zoomers, who want acceleration with little patience for restraint; and bloomers, who see major upside while still taking risks seriously. Hoffman explicitly places himself with the bloomers. That self-placement matters because it tells you what kind of optimist this is. It is not the optimism of denial. It is the optimism of someone trying to keep aspiration alive while still acknowledging turbulence, adaptation costs, and governance challenges. That framework also helps explain who the book is arguing with. Much of Superagency reads as a long answer to the gloomers. The authors know readers worry about job loss, disinformation, surveillance, concentration of power, and cognitive passivity. They do not dismiss those worries as silly. They instead argue that fears about agency loss accompany almost every major technological transition, and that history gives reason to think such fears do not automatically define the long-term outcome. The printing press spread destabilizing ideas, yet also widened literacy and knowledge. Industrial tools displaced work, yet also expanded productivity and abundance. The internet created manipulation, yet also transformed access and communication. AI, on this reading, belongs in that same family, destabilizing in transition, but not reducible to its most alarming possibilities. This historical move is one of the book's most effective strategies. Hoffman and Beato keep resisting the assumption that our current anxieties are wholly unprecedented. Their point is not that history repeats mechanically. It is that new general-purpose technologies regularly arrive wrapped in narratives of civilizational danger. Religious authorities feared the printing press would unmake social order. Critics feared the telephone would weaken genuine human connection. Some of those anxieties contained truth, but the deeper pattern in the author's telling is that societies learn, legislate, standardize, adapt, and eventually reorganize around the new tool. That historical framing gives the book much of its confidence. It treats present-day AI panic less as a unique revelation and more as a recognizable stage in the encounter with transformative technologies. At the same time, the book does not merely want readers to feel reassured. It wants them to become participants. That is why Hoffman keeps using concrete, ordinary examples when speaking about AI, learning with a chatbot, identifying an object with a camera, routing questions through multiple agents, asking an assistant to challenge your reasoning or surface conflicting sources. These are not abstract futuristic fantasies. They are invitations to use. In a recent interview, Hoffman said he wants people to become AI curious. That phrase is more important than it sounds. It is the practical version of the book's politics. A public that is AI curious can test, criticize, compare, and demand better. A public that only fears AI from a distance is more likely either to overreact blindly or to let institutions decide everything on its behalf. That participatory element also explains why the book pays so much attention to access. The promise of AI tutors, AI health advisors, AI co-pilots for professionals, and AI guides through complicated systems is not just that high performers become even more productive. The promise is that people who were previously blocked by cost, scarcity, geography, intimidation, or institutional opacity gain leverage they did not have before. In education, that might mean individual feedback at scale. In health, it might mean first-line support when a doctor is unavailable. In law, it might mean understanding procedures that once felt impenetrable. In work, it might mean that people without elite training can still execute higher-value tasks with better support. This is why the book so often frames AI as an issue of abundance rather than novelty. The ambition is to make forms of guidance and intelligence less scarce. And yet abundance itself creates new problems, which the book does not fully solve, but does force us to confront. If intelligence becomes cheap and pervasive, how do we preserve judgment? If assistance becomes constant, how do we avoid losing initiative? If everyone has a cognitive co-pilot, what becomes the new dividing line between those who can use these tools well and those who cannot? Superagency tends to answer by emphasizing learning curves rather than permanent displacement. It suggests that people will adapt, that norms and skills will evolve, and that using AI well will become part of modern competence, much as internet literacy and smartphone literacy became ordinary expectations. That may prove true, but the adjustment period will matter enormously. The book's optimism is strongest when imagining the destination. The hardest question remains how societies navigate the uneven road between here and there. Work is one place where that unevenness becomes unavoidable. Public interviews around the book make clear that Hoffman expects professional life to change rapidly. He has said that people who refuse to use AI tools may become undertooled and uncompetitive, first in software and then across law, medicine, finance, education, and other knowledge-intensive sectors. That is a candid admission, and it gives the book more seriousness than a cheerful nothing-to-worry-about message would. Some roles will shrink, some tasks will disappear, and many professions will be reorganized around new expectations of speed, synthesis, drafting, analysis, and automation. The author's answer is not to deny that. It is to argue that AI will still mostly function as a co-pilot rather than a wholesale replacement in many domains, and that societies should build systems that help workers adapt rather than simply absorb the shock. That argument is persuasive up to a point. Historically, new tools have often created more work in some areas even as they eliminate work in others. But the book is right to insist on a subtle distinction that public debate often misses. A technology can feel like a loss of agency at the moment it forces adaptation, and still increase overall agency later. If a professional now must use AI to remain competitive, that can feel coercive. And yet, once the tool is integrated, repetitive burdens may shrink, analysis may deepen, creative iteration may accelerate, and overall capability may rise. In other words, there is a difference between transition pain and end-state potential. Superagency asks readers not to confuse the two. It is an important distinction, though one that becomes ethically meaningful only if real pathways of adaptation exist for the people most disrupted. The book is also unusually insistent that AI should not be treated only as an economic story. Again and again it returns to civic life. What happens when citizens can navigate public systems more effectively? What happens when technology helps governments become more responsive rather than merely more administrative? What happens when debate platforms are built to find overlap rather than monetize outrage? Public commentary about the book references Taiwan's Polis platform as an example of technology being used to reveal common ground in policymaking. That matters because many people assume digital tools inevitably polarize. Superagency argues that design matters. Social media did not have to become what it became. Likewise, AI-mediated public systems do not have to be optimized for extraction, division, or passivity. They can, in principle, be optimized for comprehension, participation, and responsiveness. This is one of the reasons the chapter Laws Code sits so centrally in the book. It forces us to see that values do not arrive only through legislation or mission statements. They arrive through affordances. What can a user see? What can a user challenge? What can a user change? Are sources hidden or visible? Is an appeal possible? Are alternatives available? Can people move their data? Can they compare outputs across systems? Can they understand how recommendations are shaped? If those questions sound technical, That is exactly the point. Technical design quietly becomes social order. The book's optimism only makes sense if this design layer is treated as politically significant, not as neutral plumbing. The geopolitical chapters stretch that same logic upward. Nations, too, will live inside architectures they help create or fail to create. Public discussions around the book suggest that Hoffman sees a real competition over whose institutional values get embedded into global AI systems. If liberal democracies hesitate, fragment, or regulate only through spectacle, more centralized and less accountable systems may gain the advantage. This is not only about who sells the most software. It is about whose assumptions about identity, speech, privacy, compliance, authority, and coordination become normalized in the next major layer of infrastructure. Superagency is emphatically not isolationist on this point, but it is strategic. It treats AI as part of the institutional and civilizational contest over how open societies remain capable. There is a revealing tension here. On one side, the book trusts experimentation, markets, and broad diffusion. On the other, it worries about geopolitical rivalry and the possibility that authoritarian systems may move differently and faster. That tension mirrors the central difficulty of democratic technological governance itself. Democracies want innovation without surrendering accountability. They want speed without arbitrary power. They want competitive advantage without abandoning rights. The book does not pretend that balancing these goods is easy, but it does insist that democracies cannot solve the balance by stepping out of the game. They have to build, regulate, and participate at the same time. Another strength of the book is that it sees agency as collective as well as individual. That point is easy to miss because so much AI marketing talks about personal assistance, personal productivity, and personalized everything. Hoffman's use of the car analogy keeps pushing beyond that individual frame. My gain changes your world, and your gain changes mine. This is true in medicine, where better tools for researchers and clinicians can affect patients who never touch the system directly. It is true in education, where teachers, students, administrators, and parents all exist inside a changing support environment. It is true in democracy, where one citizen's access to better understanding can influence the quality of public discourse for others. Superagency, in this sense, is a social multiplier. That may be the most important conceptual contribution of the whole book. And that multiplier cuts both ways. If beneficial AI can compound, so can harmful AI. Better tools for understanding can become better tools for targeting. Better tools for communication can become better tools for manipulation. Faster iteration can create safer systems, but it can also create faster-moving harms when incentives are wrong. The book is strongest when it acknowledges this without letting the symmetry collapse into cynicism. Yes, amplification is double-edged. But no, that does not mean the only rational response is to suppress amplification itself. It means that agency, transparency, competition, oversight, and democratic legitimacy matter even more because the effects scale. In that way, the book's optimism remains conditional. The upside is real but not self-executing. One final dimension deserves attention: tone. Superagency is not written in the language of resignation. It is written in the language of invitation. Even the title sounds like a challenge to a culture that has become more comfortable forecasting disaster than constructing alternatives. That rhetorical choice is not cosmetic. It is part of the book's thesis. Societies often become what they repeatedly imagine. If institutions, media, and citizens imagine AI only as dispossession, then policy, investment, education, and adoption may all orient around defensiveness or paralysis. If they imagine it only as profit, then public purpose gets crowded out. By asking what could go right, Hoffman and Beato are trying to recover a planning imagination, a capacity to hold beneficial possibility in view long enough to build toward it. That does not guarantee they are right on every empirical point, but it does make the book valuable. In a discourse crowded with warnings, Superagency performs a rarer intellectual task. It defends the legitimacy of hope without pretending hope is enough. It says, in effect, that the future of AI will not be decided by fear alone, or by capability alone, but by whether we can connect capability to human ends through design, governance, iteration, and widespread participation. That is a serious thesis. And whether you agree with every part of it or not, it is exactly the kind of thesis worth wrestling with rather than dismissing. It is also worth dwelling on the phrase techno-humanist, because it quietly holds the book together. A less careful writer might simply call AI useful and leave it there. Hoffman and Beato want something stronger. They want to reclaim the idea that technology can support what is most recognizably human rather than hollow it out. That is why the book keeps circling back to learning, care, creativity, judgment, and community, instead of only output and efficiency. In the author's view, agency is not about pressing more buttons faster. It is about being able to pursue things that matter, to research, to create, to care for others, to understand a system well enough to navigate it, to decide with greater confidence, to act without being crushed by needless complexity. That is a richer and more defensible vision than the usual automation story. Seen this way, even the book's most contested chapters become easier to understand. The Triumph of the Private Commons is not really a data chapter. It is a chapter about how shared informational resources might support people rather than bureaucracies or monopolies. Informational GPS is not really a metaphor chapter. It is a chapter about how guidance can preserve and extend choice instead of replacing it. Law as Code is not merely a warning about software architecture. It is a chapter about how freedom depends on the shape of the systems within which we exercise it. Networked autonomy is not only about coordination. It is about how human beings remain authors of their own lives while moving through tightly coupled infrastructures. The geopolitical chapter is not only about national rivalry. It is about whether democratic values remain present in the next layer of intelligence systems that will structure everyday life. There's also an understated philosophical move inside the book that deserves attention. Superagency treats intelligence almost as a public utility in the making. Not public in the narrow ownership sense, but public in the older civilizational sense of something so foundational that it changes the baseline conditions under which people live. Cheap electricity changed what homes, factories, and cities could do. Cheap computation changed administration, communication, and research. More abundant machine intelligence, if the book is right, could change the ordinary texture of problem-solving itself. That is an astonishing proposition. It means that what has historically been scarce, knowledgeable guidance, patient explanation, pattern recognition across huge information sets, rapid drafting, continuous feedback, may become much more available to far more people. If that happens, one of the most important social questions will be cultural rather than technical. Will people treat AI as a substitute for thinking or as a partner in thinking? Hoffman's own usage patterns, described in interviews, point toward the second model. He talks about orchestrating multiple agents, challenging drafts, seeking alternative lenses, using AI to surface objections, and refining prompts to improve reasoning. In other words, good use is active, not passive. It resembles directing a team more than pressing a magic button. That distinction may become one of the central literacy divides of the next decade. People who know how to interrogate, compare, verify, and redirect AI may gain much more than people who merely ask for answers and accept whatever comes back. Superagency gestures toward this emerging literacy, even when it does not formalize it as a full framework. That may also be the most practical lesson a reader can take from the book. The future it describes will not be built only by founders, regulators, and frontier labs. It will also be built by ordinary patterns of use. Teachers deciding whether to integrate tutoring assistants. doctors deciding how to use drafting or triage support, workers deciding whether to let repetitive tasks be automated, citizens deciding whether to trust or challenge AI summaries of policy, law, or media, parents deciding how children encounter these tools, institutions deciding what standards of disclosure and oversight matter. In that sense, the book's insistence on widespread participation is not rhetorical flair. It is a sober observation about how general-purpose technologies actually settle into society. They are shaped from above and below at the same time, and this is exactly where the book's critics, even when they disagree with it, inadvertently confirm its importance. If you worry that Hoffman underestimates concentration of power, you are already thinking in the terms the book wants you to think in: who gets agency and who writes the rules. If you worry that iterative deployment can excuse harm, you are still participating in the book's central framework. How do we move toward useful systems while preserving human control and accountability? If you worry that techno-humanism can become a gloss over corporate incentives, you are again inside the same underlying debate. Can institutions align powerful tools with human ends, or will they mainly align them with extraction? The book forces those questions into a clearer shape even when it does not settle them for everyone. So, stepping back from the details, what kind of book is Superagency, really? It is partly a defense of optimism. It is partly a roadmap for governance. It is partly a critique of precautionary reflexes. It is partly a civic argument that democratic societies must stay active in the design of AI. It is partly a cultural intervention aimed at resetting the emotional baseline of the conversation. And most of all, it is a book about standards. Not standards in the technical specification sense, but in the evaluative sense. By what standard should we judge AI? Hoffman and Beato answer, judge it by whether it expands meaningful human agency at scale. That standard is both simple and demanding. It is simple because anyone can understand it. More agency means more ability to pursue goals, solve problems, and navigate the world. It is demanding because it cuts across every layer of the stack. A dazzling model that confuses users, hides trade-offs, centralizes power, weakens public oversight, and narrows real choice would fail the standard. A less spectacular model that helps more people learn, work, communicate, and access systems with greater confidence might pass it. The standard pushes the conversation away from sheer capability and toward human consequence. And perhaps that is the right final lens through which to hear the book. Superagency does not ask us to love AI. It asks us to evaluate AI ambitiously, not with passive awe, not with reflexive dread, ambitiously. Can this technology genuinely help children learn better, patients get help sooner, workers adapt more effectively, researchers discover faster, citizens participate more meaningfully, and institutions become more navigable? Can it do those things without turning the people it helps into objects of hidden control? Can it widen the circle of competence rather than merely enrich the already empowered? Can it become, in Arianna Huffington's language about the book, not just a force for more action, but a force for something more humane? Those are enormous questions, and the book does not pretend otherwise. But that is why it leaves an impression. It treats the AI era as something larger than a product cycle and more serious than a culture war. It treats it as a test of whether modern societies can still align powerful tools with human flourishing. That phrase can sound lofty, but in practice it comes down to very grounded realities. Whether a person can get help, understand a system, do better work, learn faster, feel less lost, and remain more in charge of their own direction. If the book sometimes sounds sweeping, that is because the authors believe the stakes are sweeping. And they may be right. We may be at the beginning of a period where the cost of accessing useful intelligence falls dramatically, where cognitive support becomes ambient, and where the architecture of that support starts shaping education, work, law, politics, and everyday life as deeply as search engines or smartphones once did. If so, then the question of agency is not a side issue. It is the issue. So here is the cleanest way to hold the whole book in mind after all the examples, chapters, metaphors, and policy debates have passed by. Superagency is a wager that AI can become a broad-based amplifier of human freedom rather than a broad-based system of dependence. A wager that innovation, if steered intelligently, can generate safer and more inclusive outcomes rather than simply faster disruption. A wager that democratic societies, despite their messiness, can still shape major technologies rather than only react to them. A wager that shared knowledge, smarter tools, and better design can help people become more capable in ways that compound socially. A wager, finally, that asking what could go right is not foolish optimism, but a prerequisite for building futures worth living in. And that is where I think the summary should leave you. Not with certainty, because the book itself is about an open future. Not with passivity, because the book rejects passivity at every level. But with a sharper criterion and a more demanding imagination. If AI is going to be part of the world we hand to one another, then it should be judged by how well it helps human beings remain agents, not spectators, in their own lives. That is the heart of superagency. Everything else in the book is an elaboration of that demand. So as we close, here is the question the book leaves hanging in the air, and it is the right question to end on. When intelligence becomes dramatically more abundant, what kind of society do we want that abundance to serve? A more concentrated one, where cognition itself becomes another gate-kept utility. Or a more participatory one, where tools help people learn faster, build more, care better, navigate complexity, and act with more confidence inside their communities and institutions. Hoffman and Beato believe the second path is still open, not guaranteed, not automatic, open, and that may be the most useful kind of optimism there is. Not optimism as prediction, but optimism as responsibility. A belief that the better future exists as a design challenge, a civic challenge, and a moral challenge, and that withdrawing from the work almost guarantees you'd to a worse result. If this summary gave you something real to think about, like the video, share it with someone who is trying to understand AI beyond the panic and the hype, and leave a comment with your own takeaway. And for the final comment ritual, type this: I choose agency. It is the cleanest way to capture the book's core message and the clearest way to carry it with you after this video ends. The future Hoffman and Beato describe is not one where humans vanish into the machine. It is one where we learn awkwardly and imperfectly how to use a new form of intelligence to become more capable, more connected, and maybe even more human. Whether that happens will depend on what we build, what we permit, what we demand, and what we refuse to ignore. See you in the next summary.